All right, testing this out again. Hello and welcome. My name is Josie Yort. I am your host for Doing Life Divergent, where we bring you stories, real experiences, and expertise about all things neurodiversity. Thank you for being here with me, and let's get started. Today's episode is going to touch on three main things that I want to just outline for you here. The episode's going to be a bit shorter than last time because I am aware of my audience and, thanks to analytics, aware of our attention spans. And I'm going to aim for about 20 minutes. But in those 20 minutes, I want to talk about experience that I've been having personally, but that is such a universal experience for both people who are neurodivergent themselves, as well as people who are the parents or caregivers of neurodivergent children. So in today's episode, we're going to talk about what are some of the symptoms, signs, traits that might cue a parent into seeking out a diagnosis for a child or treatment options for a child. We are going to talk about the experience of being a parent of a neurodivergent child and what that looks like, feels like, and how the expressions of that neurodivergence or mental health can both affirm and trigger our own feelings, thoughts, awarenesses of our lineage of neurodiversity and mental health. And then the last thing that we're going to talk about is the decision of whether or not to medicate. So here we go. I'm so thankful that everyone is joining me. This topic is important to me. It is not where I thought I was going to be going with episode 2, but it is what is present in my world right now. And if you are a teacher or parent of anyone who is a young person who struggles with mental health, or if you yourself struggle with mental health, 'tis the season. It is December, and we're in that span of time between Thanksgiving and winter holidays, winter break, where things get crazy. They get crazy, crazy in a classroom, in a school, in any space that has anyone in it who has mental health issues or trauma, or is just aware of the energy that is around us right now. So if you've been having a challenging time as of late, it was also a full moon last week, just know that you're not alone. And you're not alone in what we're about to talk about next. So I'm going to start off just kind of backing up and telling the story of what our lived experience has been for the past couple of years and in the past couple of months with our youngest child, who we now have a diagnosis of ADHD for. So she is a vibrant being and has been since the day that she was born. And we have known for a while that we were going to go down this route of getting a diagnosis and treating any, potential things that came up. We knew that ADHD was most likely going to be a diagnosis for her. And throughout the past couple of years, we started to see some of those signs and traits that really clued us into, yes, this is the road we're going to have to go down, but more significantly, how it's manifesting for her. So at about age 5, right, that transition into kindergarten is when we started to really see that some of these traits that have been present for her whole life really are not fitting into, not allowing her to be successful in a classroom. So she was at a daycare center or a daycare, sorry, home daycare with about 7 other kids or so when she was little. And so a lot of the things that we have seen were not really an issue there, right? And so when people go to seek diagnosis, whether it's for a child or for themselves, it is often because it is presenting as an issue that is conflicting or challenging what they need to do in their life, right? It's making their life difficult. So, some of the signs that we have seen for her have been the hyperactivity, right? So, one of the description points on the Vanderbilt scale, which is a scale that we use to diagnose ADHD in children, is called and literally is acts as if driven by a motor. So that can be somewhat subjective, right? But when you see it in a child or in a person, it's very descriptive, really, of what you're seeing. So she has always been a loud child, a child who needs to run and tumble and push and fall, a child who has like surplus energy, wakes up at 6 a.m. ready to go, doesn't ever have that stop or pause button unless it's a crash, and then can keep going and often needs that vestibular stimulation and does like cartwheels and handstands and rolls around a ton before finally shutting down at night. So there's that piece. What we have also seen and what has maybe been more challenging for us is the emotional reactivity and the inability to regulate. So this is a symptom of ADHD, which can often be difficult, right? If this is showing up, it's sometimes hard to see that it is because of ADHD. And this is why a lot of people, especially in years past, who had this inability to regulate emotions were diagnosed with anxiety and depression instead of knowing that this is also a core component of ADHD. So what we have seen from her are the extreme highs and the extreme lows and just the inability to bring herself down or get herself back up without that kind of co-regulation of an adult supporting her. So this became much more pronounced over the past 2 years. And then this past summer was at an all-time high and really caused a lot of distress, both for her, but also for my husband and I and our other children, because it started to manifest in a way that it was impacting our daily life. Instances of extreme tantruming, inability to move forward from that tantrum for at times hours. And, that impacted the activities that we were trying to do as a family and, our nighttime routines around dinner and bedtime and all of that. So that was a big component kind of leading up to our understanding of now's the time that we need to be active in getting this treated. There was also, and there has been for a long time, a lot of sensory seeking. So I could talk for days about sensory input, but in terms of a diagnosis and when it becomes problematic, what we have seen, so she's a sensory seeker who likes loud noises. She is quite loud herself. Deep pressure and that stimulation of, like I said, bumping into things or like grabbing on, holding on to people, being smushed. The like high tactileness of needing to touch and dig and just be messy all the time. That got to a point where, again, because she was becoming bigger, right, has a bigger body, doesn't know how strong her body is. That got to a point where it became problematic because of that interchange, right, between people. Like, you're bumping into me, and when you were little, it was fine and I could manage it, but now you're big and it's pushing me over, type of thing, right? So those were kind of some of the 3 main things that we started to see. And then she had transitions. So there was the transition into kindergarten, which was a challenge. And I won't, ever forget our first conference with her teacher where the teacher said, about a month in, oh, she's starting to talk and not just speak in cat, which we were very familiar with at home. Cat is often the language that she kind of reverts to or goes to when she's having trouble expressing emotions. So that was a clue, right? And the attachment increased when she first started kindergarten, and the need for attention and attention demands increased. But we got through it at that stage. Her kindergarten teacher, really helped to work through that with her in ways that were manageable in the classroom. But then this year, we had that difficult summer. A lot of those things for us were coming up, and transitioning into first grade this year, it was much more visible and much more problematic, to the point where we were getting emails home about things like, avoidance behavior, where she's hiding in the bathroom and exchanging with friends who also should not be hiding in the bathroom, or just not able to focus, not able to stay in her seat, constantly kind of bouncing around. We had a bus incident where we got a write up because of that same thing, like bouncing in and out of her bus seat, not able to be safe. So all of these things, and on top of that, and what was probably the most triggering for me, was the negative self-talk and the feelings of unworthiness, not lovable, not able to do things. She would call herself stupid. And there were a few times, that over the course of the summer and then into the school year, she talked about self-harm. And so for anybody who has been a parent or a caregiver for a child who starts to talk about self-harm, or not wanting to be in the world, not feeling deserving of living, that is a scary moment. And I have to just pause there, because this is, kind of where we see that ripple effect of intergenerational experiences of mental health and experiences of the trauma of having a mental health diagnosis or disorder. When we start to see that manifest in our children, it is very, very hard. And it's very difficult to not blame yourself. Before I ever got pregnant, I was in the stages, we had just gotten married, where I was trying to get pregnant. We had a little bit of a difficult time. I went to see an Ayurvedic doctor because I was very into learning about Ayurveda, and was practicing and teaching yoga at the time. And I went to see this Ayurvedic doctor, and said that I was trying to get pregnant. And, we discussed my whole medical history, and part of that was my mental health history. And he said to me, oh, okay, well, you're going to kind of want to be, mindful of your mental health, because it's mothers who pass down their mental health to their children. I mean, and let me just pause there to say, of course, even not a white man, but a man, putting that guilt and blame onto mothers, right? It's like, okay, red flag. We don't need anybody to put that on us. We put it on ourselves. But I've thought about that a lot since then, and into having children. And what we know from research is that several of the mental health issues and disabilities that are often comorbid actually do have genetic factors where they are passed down between family members. So things like ADHD, mood disorders, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, anxiety disorders, eating disorders, schizophrenia, autism. These are all things that can have genetic components. But what the research also shows us is that even though we have these genetic components, it's also environment and stress levels that can trigger and make genes manifest these traits in different ways. So, side note, let's take the blame out of this. This is something I need to hear and say to myself constantly, right? It is not your fault your child's mental health and whatever disability or difference they might present with, their neurodiversity is not your fault. In that, it is still very triggering. So when she started to have these negative self-harm thoughts and negative self-talk, it was a big trigger for me because of my family lineage of mental health, and particularly the history of women in my family with mental health. So, while I'm understanding that what that Ayurvedic doctor said to me is not necessarily fully true, right? We know that genes are also passed down through the male chromosome that helps to make a baby. But what I have seen in my family history is that mental health can impact and be manifested differently in women. And we see research around this coming out now, especially for ADHD, because for so long, ADHD research was based solely on male bodies. And so some of the components of ADHD that we're now just kind of finding out are more impactful for women were really not talked about for many years. Similarly to other mental health disorders. So it's great that we live in the day and age that we do, that we're starting to understand that the impacts of these disorders, A, are not just genetic, B, are also, influenced by environment and stress, which are things that, we have some bit of control over, but also are really kind of linked in such a way that when we can bring awareness to the ways in which these things manifest, we can also press the pause button on some of those things. So that kind of brings us into the next stage, right? Because here I am, a person who is neurodivergent myself, who has this family lineage of mental health with people who are experiencing kind of all of the things that I named, right? We clearly have this genetic component in my maternal family of bipolar disorder, eating disorders, addiction, schizophrenia, although I do question that diagnosis somewhat. And I actually feel that my attentional difficulties are more on my paternal side. But we have information and research, and I can link some of this in the notes, about the genetic components of that and, how it manifests generationally. So when I see this in my own child, that's where my mind goes, right? Not just to the blame part of that, but to the understanding of, if I can disrupt or somehow interrupt some of the triggers environmentally and stress-wise that might be impacting this genetic component, then maybe I have the chance to give her the tools that she needs earlier so that this lineage of mental health is more subdued. It's a tough one. It's a very tough conversation to have with yourself, with others, with your significant other, your co-parenting person. It's a big deal, and the reason that she's so young, but the reason that I felt the call to action to go to doctors, to go to therapists, to get a diagnosis for her at this age, is because that what research is showing us now is the earlier that we can disrupt, not just the environmental factors, but the stigmatization of a mental health disorder. The earlier that we can disrupt that, the earlier that we can provide treatment for that we can provide information for that individual to be able to self-advocate, that we can provide families with ways to cope and strategies to use to support individuals, the better chance, the better outcomes that we can have with these issues. So that moves us into the next section of seeking out treatment and a diagnosis. This is often a scary and a big first step for families, especially when children are young age. But it's really actually quite simple in terms of what you need to do. So I mentioned earlier that we used the Vanderbilt scale. So I started my daughter in therapy, just going kind of every other week with a therapist that we had used with my son, who specializes in ADHD and children, works with children. And we discussed, all of the things that I was seeing. He got to know her, saw her a couple of times. And I said, I think I want to go down the route of getting a diagnosis. So he gave me the Vanderbilt scale. So this is, about a 2-page form that you fill out. It's a rating scale of all these different traits. And you give one to the child's teacher to fill out. And then there's a family form to fill out. So each of us filled these forms out separately, and then I brought them to her doctor, actually a nurse practitioner at her doctor's office, who was also the same nurse practitioner who I discussed this with for my son several years ago. And she looked at these forms, and what was interesting about them, because you have to have, in order to have a diagnosis, you have to have the symptomology be present in more than one environment. So we have the home environment and we have the school environment. And if it's showing up one place, if it's showing up just in the home, but it's not showing up in the school, then we can't diagnose. And that was something that happened in this early stage with my son when he was this age, because it wasn't showing up yet in the school environment. But he was also a first grader in the year of COVID. So it makes sense that it wouldn't have shown up. School was disrupted and, everything was, as crazy. And so for him, it didn't really show up until when he came back to school in 3rd grade. But now here we are in 1st grade and it's showing up. And so the Vanderbilt scale, the way that it was filled out, showed a little bit of differences in the way that we're seeing it manifest at home versus at school. At school, it's much more of an inattentiveness based on the rating scale. And then at home, it's much more of the hyperactivity based on the way that we filled out the rating scale. So when we talked to the nurse practitioner, she said it still gives us that evidence that it is attentional deficit, but it is combined type, at least in the way that it's presenting right now. So she's waving in the background. So it's, it was enough to get the diagnosis, excuse me. And the question after that, right, is always, okay, what next, right? We know that this is a thing for her. It's a thing that's problematic for her. What are the treatment options? So we were already in therapy, but I did, talk to a few people who said it would be more beneficial to be in therapy as regularly as once a week because we're going to see more growth. We're going to see more consistency. So, I sought that out. But sitting in that office with the nurse practitioner, she's a prescriber. And so she said, this is the point, right? This is the point at which we have to make a decision as parents, whether or not to medicate our child. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge and it's controversial, right? We know in our current environment, a lot of people are pushing back against medication. Our government is pushing back against medications, and not because there's not reason to, right? I mean, when you put a substance into your body or into your child's body, you want to be considering the impact of that. But from my perspective, both parental and as an educator, the adverse effects that we see, the traumatization that we see of kids in schools who have either undiagnosed or untreated ADHD or other mental health diagnosis, that can be more damaging than a medication. So, growing up having to mask or having to fit in to a system that is not built for you, right? Kids with ADHD need movement. They need constant stimulation. They need co-regulation strategies. They need social emotional skills explicitly taught. They need help with peer relationships. All of that is, definitely more present in our school systems today than it was years ago, but also difficult to implement sometimes in a classroom with 25 kids at the level to which a child might need, right? And so then that's where you start to see kids struggle with their self-confidence. You start to see the negative feelings about school and the school avoidance. We were starting to see that with her and constantly asking to go to the nurse, right? So she wanted to take several nurse trips per day, in part to kind of avoid that challenge of being in the classroom and feeling like I can't manage it, and I'm bad for that. There's something wrong with me for that. So all of that to say, I decided that we would try a medication in hopes of preventing that stigmatization and that negative experience of school and of being at home too, right? Like it's the same for kids at home who are constantly being redirected or told that they're too much. We actually had a moment in the doctor's office where the NP kind of described her as somebody who can be seen as too much. And I said, I hate that. I hate that language because that's a terrible feeling, right? The feeling of being too much for the world or too much for the space that you're in, too much for any particular person, whether it's your friend or your partner or sibling. That just creates, again, that trauma of being neurodivergent. And I don't want that. I know that I'm potentially passing down these traits of neurodivergence to my children. I don't want them to have the traumatic experiences associated with having a diagnosis, right? That is my whole mission in my work and in this podcast. Let's decrease the stigmatization. Let's make it okay to get an accurate diagnosis, to learn about your diagnosis, to advocate for yourself based on your diagnosis and the needs that you have. Let's do that at a young age. Because if we can avoid the trauma associated with feeling othered, with feeling too much or not enough, that's how we start to break this intergenerational experience of mental health. So that's where we're at. I promised I would keep it short. I would love to dive deeper into the research around this with you. What's promising is that, if we get real sciencey into the neuroscience of the brain, the new research that's on the horizon that's looking at this genome is discovering the link between these different mental health disorders. So between ADHD and autism and mood disorders and depression, right? There is a genetic link, but what they're researching is if they have this commonality, perhaps there is a treatment that influences this link that can then influence the manifestation of any of these, right? So if we have that gene and we can help with how it manifests at an early age, that could be huge for society. So go science. yay research. Let's hope that that keeps happening. And let's also just give ourselves a lot of grace if we are experiencing the challenges of loving people who are just coming into having a diagnosis, loving ourselves if we are the caretakers of somebody who has a recent diagnosis, understanding and loving our students who may be struggling with their own mental health at this time of year. I am so grateful to be in this conversation with all of you, and so grateful that you have joined me in this topic. So that's it for Doing Life Divergent today, and I hope to see all of you next time. That's it for today's episode of Doing Life Divergent. Thank you so much for being here with me. I'm Josie Yort, your host. It helps so much if you like, subscribe, or comment as we continue to try to bring you these episodes. Take care.